Thank you, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. In the South, where I come from, if someone says good afternoon from the spot, the audience is supposed to say, thank you, I feel at home now. It is wonderful to be back in Richmond and see so many friends, see so many old friends, especially Amy Crumbine, 101 years young. Amy, thank you for having me over for our Friday night dinner so many times. Thank you, thank you. You know, it's a particularly humbling day to be here under circumstances like this. Too soft, I'm sorry. To be able to share this day with Roger, Helena, Alec, Odette, and Henry. You guys, you represent the best of the human spirit, and we have a tremendous debt. We owe you a tremendous debt for the example that you've set. I know that Sam mentioned earlier that we lost a survivor this past year, Clara Daniels, and I know also we lost Simone Schwartz. I'm glad to see her daughter and her son here today. You know, before I came into this room, my sister and I, my beautiful sister, Susan Cohen, and I walked through this facility, and quite frankly, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming to contemplate the suffering. It's overwhelming to contemplate the barbarity, and it's overwhelming to contemplate the responsibility each and every one of us has not to forget. Sam mentioned to me that soon there's going to be an exhibit for what happened in Charlottesville back in August. It was truly, truly a shocking thing. You know, we had saw hundreds of neo-Nazis, assorted racists, march in the street carrying guns and clubs and bats, Confederate flags, all in a city only 70 miles from here. They came to support a monument to white supremacy, a statue of a Confederate general, much like the statues that still adorn Monument Avenue in this city. As they marched with their tiki torches, they shouted, "You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us." By the time they were gone, a young woman whose family we represent, Heather Heyer, had been killed. 2 law enforcement officers trying to keep the peace that day had lost their lives, and only over 30 people had been injured. The cry, "You will not replace us," is actually a very familiar theme in the white supremacist world. It reflects the common idea among white supremacists that they're being displaced, culturally displaced. They look at the country's changing demographics. They understand that in mid-century, America will be a minority-majority country, and they see what they call white genocide. It's a fear that's propelled the growth of the hate movement for the last 20 years. It's a fear that led Dylan Roof to kill 9 African Americans in a church in Charleston. The cry, "Jews will not replace us," was also not really new. It reflects the age-old belief that Jews have hidden powers and are somehow working in conspiratorial ways to manipulate events to the detriment of their host countries. It was expressed in the 1920s by the likes of Henry Ford, then the richest person in the world, who published a series of articles under the heading "The International Jew," that claimed that Jewish bankers had orchestrated the First World War. It was expressed after President Obama's first election by the likes of David Duke, who said that Obama was visual proof that the nefarious Jew had stolen their country on behalf of minorities. And it was expressed at the time of Charlottesville by the likes of Andrew Anglin, who said that Jews were behind mass immigration, feminism, the news media, Hollywood, the wars in the Middle East, and of course the global banking system. Anglin is not someone that you've ever heard of, but Anglin is a very prominent neo-Nazi. He runs something called the Daily Stormer. It's a website that draws its name from the Nazi Party's tabloid, Der Stürmer. It is the most heavily trafficked neo-Nazi site in the English language. He's part of a new breed of white supremacists in the digital age, but his ideas have been staples on the radical right literally for decades. What was truly shocking about Charlottesville wasn't so much the ideas that were expressed that day, but really the sheer size of the gathering. My colleagues and I at the Southern Poverty Law Center have been tracking, hate group activity for almost 40 years. And frankly, we had never seen anything like it. It tells us that something has changed dramatically in our country. As the second President Bush said in his speech after Charlottesville, bigotry seems emboldened. Our politics seem more vulnerable to conspiracy theories and outright fabrications. The bigotry that President Bush spoke about is not confined to the likes of the organized racists that we saw in Charlottesville. We hear it now so often on the streets. Teachers tell us that they're hearing it in their classrooms. Truly, truly, something has changed. Now, President Bush didn't name names in his speech, but Congress did. It passed a joint, bipartisan, unanimous resolution condemning hate. Furthermore, every member of Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, urged the president to speak out against racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy. Why did every member of Congress call out the president and urge him to do that? Because the president had equivocated after Charlottesville. I think we'll all remember that. He said there were bad people on both sides. And frankly, that's probably true. We had some of the counter-protesters, Antifa, really coming there itching for a pipe. But the president also said that there were fine people on both sides. And that seems to be certainly false, because I know of no fine people that day marching with tiki torches and saying Jews will not replace us. How many lawyers do we have in the room? Right. I'm going to explain a legal point here that I think is important to understand. If Congress had simply passed a concurrent resolution, as it often does, the president would have been free to ignore it. But by passing what's called a joint resolution, Congress put the resolution on the president's desk and compelled him either to sign it or to veto it. And sign it the president did, though behind closed doors. There was no signing ceremony in the Rose Garden, no cameras in the Oval Office that day. Now look, I don't want to call the president a bigot any more than the members of Congress did after Charlottesville. But I do agree with something that Jonathan Weissman said in his recent book, Semitism. While Mr. Trump may not have wanted to have anything to do with the anti-Semites who were energized by his campaign, the anti-Semites certainly want to have something to do with him. Typically in an election, the white supremacists, they sit it out. They think both parties are irredeemably corrupt, not a dime's worth of difference between them from their point of view. This time it was different for some reason. David Duke, for example, very famously said that it would be treasonous for white people, not to vote for Mr. Trump. After the election, Representative Mark Sanford, a Republican from South Carolina, a conservative Republican, said that Mr. Trump's campaign had unearthed some demons. He added that people feel like if the President of the United States can say anything to anybody at any time, I guess I can too. And that's a very, very dangerous situation. We did 2 surveys last year of teachers. Our Teaching Tolerance Project goes to literally every school in the country. And we asked teachers, what's been the impact of the campaign? What's been the impact of the election in your classroom? We didn't use any of the candidates' names. And quite frankly, we didn't have to. We heard story after story about an increase in bullying, story after story about an increase in name calling. Students, particularly immigrant students, living in fear. One of the letters that I got was, I'll never forget it, it was from a teacher from the Midwest, and she said, look, when kids would say ugly things or off-color things in my classroom in the past, I could look at them with just one look or one word and get them to stop it. Nowadays, I can't, because they say, gosh, I heard that kind of language from a candidate on TV. What all of this tells us, what all of this tells me, is that the social fabric in our country has been frayed and that hate is being normalized. We seem to have lost our sense of shame. You know, sometimes we hear people say, no one's born a bigot. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thought, but I'm not so sure it's true. People are ethnocentric beings. As an evolutionary matter, as a matter of instincts of survival, we tend to prefer people like ourselves. It takes civilization, it takes our families, our schools, our religious institutions to help us curb our ethnocentric instincts. And now that these norms have been frayed, now that these social norms have been frayed, I don't think it's always going to be so easy to stitch them back together, to put them back in a bottle. Don't get me wrong. I am not here to condemn Mr. Trump. As a Jew, I appreciate his steadfast support of Israel, a country born out of the devastation, the ashes of the Holocaust. But as Sam said earlier, as Jews, we have an obligation to speak truth to power, an obligation to speak out against bigotry in all of its forms. If we applaud President Trump for protecting us abroad, we cannot close our eyes to the fact that he is sometimes fomenting ethnic tensions at home. Right now, I have a client who lives in Whitefish, Montana, of all places. Her name is Tanya Gersh. Some of you may have heard of her. Tanya grew up in the resort town of Sun Valley, Idaho. Her parents weren't on the ski slopes. They were working class people. While Tanya's friends drove fancy cars to school, Tanya wore garage sale clothes to her classes. Her parents told her she didn't need a lot of things. All she needed was a lot of love. Tanya worked hard and put herself through the University of Montana. There, she met the love of her life, a young man named Judah Gersh. They got married and moved to Whitefish, where Judah opened a law practice and Tanya got a real estate license. Today, they have two wonderful sons, Jacob and Micah. That's kind of Judah, Jacob, and Micah. I don't have to tell you where they go to synagogue. Another person who happens to live in Whitefish is a gentleman named Richard Spencer. Some of you may have heard of him before. He's the person who coined the term alt-right. It's kind of a fancy name for white supremacy in the digital age. It's like a leader of the modern white nationalist movement. He was also one of the leaders of the protest of the debacle in Charlottesville. UVA was the school from which he graduated. Now, shortly after Mr. Trump was elected, and I think many people remember this, 10 days after Mr. Trump's election, Spencer held a white supremacist rally just a few blocks from the White House. It ended with Spencer yelling, "Hail Trump, hail our people, hail victory," as 200 white supremacists sieg-heiled him. Tanya, unfortunately, got crosswise with Richard Spencer's mother. The details aren't particularly important. It was over a real estate matter. Andrew England, the neo-Nazi I mentioned before, the person who runs the Daily Stormer, caught wind of the dispute. And he urged his followers through his website that reaches millions to start harassing Tanya and her family. In short order, they had received far more than 700 anti-Semitic messages, phone calls, letters. Most of the messages, quite frankly, aren't things that I can read here. They are just too vile. Some of the tamer ones were things like, thanks for demonstrating why your race needs to be collectively othered. We're going to keep track of you from the rest of your life. Tanya would sometimes get phone calls in the middle of the night, and all she would hear would be gunshots. Her son, Jacob, who was studying for his bar mitzvah at the time, got messages with pictures of ovens and said, Jacob, crawl into there because there's a video game there for you. Anglin posted pictures of Tanya and her son Jacob on the gates of Auschwitz. He told his neo-Nazi followers to call Tanya, to pose as people interested in buying a home in Whitefish, to try to get Tanya away from her office and try to get someplace where she would be alone. The impact on Tanya, predictably, was quite devastating. She suffered from anxiety attacks. She lost hair. She was fearful of going outside. She had to abandon her business. She didn't know who the customers were who were calling her, and she felt as if she couldn't put her own customers whose houses she was selling at risk. We reached out to Tanya last year and offered our assistance. I told her, I said, Tanya, look, I don't have any idea whether Andrew Anglin has any significant assets. I can't tell you that there's going to be some kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow if we win a lawsuit. And I told her something else I thought was quite important. I said, Tanya, look, Anglin might retaliate if you file suit. He might step up the harassment against you and your family. Many, many people around Tanya counseled her not to sue Anglin. Many people said, lay low. Don't provoke him. Maybe he'll go away and just harass someone else. But Tanya did not hesitate. This is how she explained her decision in her own words. When you go to synagogue or are part of the Jewish community, you almost always say a prayer for the 6 million who died in the Holocaust. And you always say out loud, never again. It's something instilled in us since we were children in Hebrew school. There's no way I couldn't stand up and file this suit. It's part of the core of who I am as a Jew and everything that I've been taught. I want other victims of this bigotry to know that they are not alone. Tanya is an extraordinarily brave woman. And she's told me many, many times that she's acting from a deep sense of her Jewish identity. But she's also told me that she's not acting for Jews alone. And it's always been that way for Jews in America. Jews were among the founders and early directors of the NAACP. Jews were among those who traveled to Mississippi in 1964 during Freedom Summer in an effort to extend the right to vote to all Americans. Jews were among those who died in that struggle. As Jews, we are compelled to heal the world, not just the Jewish part of it. Today, when we hear talk of a Muslim ban, we remember the restrictive immigration laws of the 1920s that limited Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe. When we read the headlines today of the government cutting back on asylum, making it more difficult for asylees to gain entry to this country, we remember the people on the ship St. Louis who saw the lights of Miami as they were forced to turn around and go back to Europe and face the prospect of the concentration camps. We live in a great country, the wealthiest and most powerful on earth. We are bound together not by blood, but by our shared ideals. We have a free, though much maligned press. We have an independent judiciary. Yet, because of our blessings, I think that there's a certain naivete to our collective consciousness. We tend to see progress as inevitable. We think of it as our manifest destiny. We tend to believe what King said, what King was fond of saying, that the moral arc of the universe may be long, but it bends to justice. We tend to think that we are immune from the dark forces of history. But as Yale professor Timothy Snyder recently wrote in his book on tyranny, Americans today are no wiser than Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism in the 20th century. Our advantage, Professor Snyder went on to say, is that we can learn from their experiences. Given what's happening in our country today, now is a good time to learn those lessons of history in order to protect our democracy. Professor Snyder offers 20 lessons in his book. I'll mention only 3 very, very briefly. First, do not obey in advance, because authoritarianism is fueled by blind obedience. Second, believe in truth, because if nothing is true, everything is spectacle, and no one can criticize those in power. Third, and most importantly, stand out, because someone has to. And to Professor Snyder's list of 20, I'll add one more of my own today. A lesson that I would say underlies each and every one of his, and that is remember. Remember the past, because a people with no memory is a people that will never be able to make sense of the present. Remember the past, because a people with no memory will never have a collective future. We all have a tremendous obligation to remember what happened when the 6 million perished. We know that many of the people here today won't be here forever. We know that in a generation their children will be gone too. It will be up to us to carry on those memories. Ask each and every one of you here today to make a commitment to those that will do just that. Thank you for having me.